We need folks from all walks of life so we understand it. Because I will assure you that had I not been the Assistant Secretary of Commerce, and had I not been, empowered by men like Mickey Leland and Ron Brown and others who said, stand up for what's right no matter what the cost. If I hadn't had that kind of training and I hadn't had my background, the digital divide would have been an afterthought.
My name is Linda Lorelle, and I'm asking you to have the courage to listen with an open mind to all of our voices, because our voices matter. I want to take a moment to thank BMW of West Houston for sponsoring this episode of our Voices Matter podcast. BMW, of course, is known as the ultimate driving machine because of its precision and power. As someone who has driven a BMW for many years now, I can attest to that firsthand. But I think what's even more important, especially about this particular BMW dealership, is that it understands the power and the impact of giving back to its community. BMW of West Houston is known for its support of countless local charities, and that is important to us here at our Voices Matter podcast. So if you choose to do business with BMW of West Houston, not only will you be getting the stellar first-class service that the dealership is known for, but you can also rest assured that you are doing business with a dealership that truly cares about and gives back to its community. Hey everybody, it's Linda Lorelle, and this is our Voices Matter podcast. Chances are you have heard the term digital divide. My guest today is the man who coined that phrase. His name is Larry Irving, and he is president of the Irving Group. That's a consulting firm to international telecommunications, media, and technology companies. Now, when Larry coined that now famous phrase, he was Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information in the Clinton administration. He was a principal advisor to the president, the vice president, and the secretary of commerce. In 2019, he was elected to the Internet Hall of Fame for his pioneering efforts identifying the digital divide and advocating for more equitable access to the internet. He was recently named as the new chairman of the board of PBS. We talk about his backstory and what led him to the work that he does today at the intersection of technology and media. And, of course, how it's playing a role as the war in Ukraine and the refugee crisis continue to unfold. It's a very important conversation, I believe, and I feel privileged to share it with you. So let's get to it. Larry Irving, it is such a pleasure to finally have an opportunity to talk with you. Welcome to our Voices Matter podcast.
It's completely my honor. Thank you, sir, very much for inviting me.
Well, we have Stanford in common, but we don't really know each other. And when I saw that you had just been appointed to the chairman of the board of PBS, I thought, I got to reach out to him because I want to talk about that. But before we get there, I want you to give our audience a little bit of your backstory. I know that you grew up in Brooklyn. How did you get from public housing in Brooklyn to Stanford, Northwestern, and beyond? Where did it start?
It started in Brooklyn. My parents were blue collar, working class. My dad had an 8th grade education. My mom had a couple years of college. She was a social worker. He was a electrician with Con Edison, union guy. They broke up before I remember. And like many families, when the civil service jobs happened, you move from Brooklyn to Queens. So I actually grew up with a backyard and a garage and a front yards. Your typical aspirational black family. And in my family, there's kind of a hope that you'd go to college, maybe an expectation to go to college, but college was any college. College would have been Queens College or a state university in New York was what kids like me at a big public high school should aspire to. And I got very lucky. A guidance counselor, Mrs. Hamilton, my junior or senior year, took a look at my grades, which were okay, and took a look at my board scores, which were very good, and said, in the 1970s, schools are looking for kids like you. And she was the one who suggested I apply to Northwestern. I thought I was an athlete. I really wasn't, but I wanted to be one. She said, look, it's a Big Ten school. If you're athletic enough, you can play football there, but you probably won't. But they'll, pay for you to go to college even if you don't have if you're not a football player or a basketball player. I never spent a dime of tuition at Northwestern or Stanford, because my family was, while blue collar was a pretty poor blue collar. And if not for Mrs. Hamilton, my life's very different. I did get into Northwestern. They did give me a scholarship. I met my wife at Northwestern. I'm now a trustee at Northwestern. None of that happened except for one black woman who looks at this black kid and sees that he's being steered in directions that weren't necessarily optimizing his talent. And then from Northwestern, I did well there. Again, grades were good. Board scores were better. It's very weird that for a lot of black folks, the bar are board scores. For me, the exit ramp, the on-ramp for me were my board scores because I was never a studious student. I was always involved in other activities. But really good board scores got me into Northwestern and Stanford. Stanford Law School, became president of my class, had no idea what I wanted to do. Thought I'd do a whole bunch of things, but decided my then girlfriend, now wife, and I were looking to settle together in Washington, D.C. And that's where I started my legal career. And it's funny, again, it's a dean at Stanford Law School, a black dean, Milton Wiggins, was really helpful, along with another dean, in steering me in to go to Stanford. That was my first choice, but family pressure. I got into Harvard. I got into 9 other schools, and a lot of you should go to Harvard, should go to Harvard. And I'm like, I'm from the East Coast. I've been in the Midwest. Stanford's a great school. It wasn't what it is today in the 70s in terms of, it was a top 5 law school. It wasn't a top 2 or 3 law school, maybe. But I thought for me, being in a smaller place that was of my own choosing would be a great experience. And I'm absolutely right. I know if I'd gone to Harvard or Yale, I never would have been number one in my class. I wouldn't have been, I was never number one. I never would have been elected president of my class. By being in a smaller place where I knew all my classmates and being president of a law school class, having the imprimatur of leadership from your law school classmates, that makes a huge difference. But the other thing about both Northwestern and Stanford are the quality of people that I met coming through those institutions who are still part of my life today. And when I talk to young students today, when I'm recruiting for Northwestern or recruiting for Stanford, I tell them, it's not just about the education you're going to get from the professors. It's not just about the physical locale. It's the relationships that you make along the way, some of which you keep. And let me give you one story that'll, I think, exemplify that.
Okay.
I'd worked in Chicago at a law firm after my first summer. I got a job offer. I worked in New York in a Wall Street firm after my second summer. I got a job offer. I wasn't going back to Chicago. It was too cold. My wife wasn't, my then girlfriend, my now wife, wasn't going back to New York. It's too big. She's a girl from Pittsburgh, a woman from Pittsburgh, didn't know people in New York, didn't want to go from Evanston to New York. So I was talking to a classmate of mine about, we were thinking about maybe Washington as the place. As it turned out, his name is Riley Bechtel. He's the ex-CEO of Bechtel Corporation. He was then the scion, the presumptive heir of Bechtel. Because he's in my small group, he said, the firm I clerked at last summer, I know the guys there. They do a lot of work for my family's company. Let me give them a call. There's no way that I'm meeting with managing the hiring partner 2 weeks later, if not for having a relationship with a Riley Bechtel. When you go to a small, sorry?
I said it's all about relationships. Yeah.
And so many of our young black students and young Latino students and women don't have this sense of, we're the outsiders. We don't have those networks growing up. For Riley, that's what you do. As a black, who am I going to call? As a black working class kid. And I always tell people, knowing the Riley Bechtels of your life, haven't talked to Riley in 20 or 30 years probably, but that one phone call that he was willing to make for his then classmate changed my life. And those are the relationships that matter. And I believe if I called, Riley now, I know he's had some illnesses. We did talk when I was an assistant secretary of commerce. But I think if I called him now, he'd remember me. He would, and I needed a favor. I think it would be there. Those are the relationships that matter. That's why you go to those kinds of institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, so many lessons in everything you just talked about. So let's talk a little bit about the beginning of your career as you moved forward. I know that at one point you were legislative director and counsel for Congressman Mickey Leland, who was
sainted Mickey Leland.
Yes.
Mickey was one of those, I was reading I know. There was a woman named Barbara Friedman in Houston who was a very close friend of Mickey's who was going to do a documentary on Mickey. And
I know Barbara Friedman.
Barbara had started fundraising to do a documentary on Mickey. And if you have time, there's if you Google it, you'll find a 2.5, 3 minute trailer that I guess she was using as a fundraising piece to do this documentary on Mickey. And the joy in that man's life. He was the first person I ever heard call himself a a citizen of the world. I'm looking at this the refugee crisis in Ukraine right now, and while I was with Mickey, he started the House Select Committee on Hunger. We Are the World was part of what he was doing. And I know if he was alive, we'd be doing something huge on this planet right now about the refugee. If 2 to 4 million people have lost their homes, looking at the footage, that most of those people are never going home again because there's no home to go to. Warsaw announced this morning that they don't have enough room to house all the people. And what you learn from a person like Mickey is, okay, that's happening. Let's fix that. Let's start right now. He'd be on the phone. He'd be working on what are we going to do to make sure these people aren't hungry. In addition to that, the Ukraine we don't think about is the breadbasket of the planet. Folks in Egypt, folks in Africa, 20 to 30% of all the wheat on the planet comes from the Ukraine. What are folks going to do as prices go up? People already on subsistence income levels. 20 or 30% increase in wheat doesn't mean much of us on this podcast, but it does mean something. Somebody's on a subsistence level in the Middle East or in Africa. Those kinds of you could have more hunger.
So let's talk about, I'm so glad you brought up Ukraine because I really did want to talk about that, especially as it relates to technology. Now, you're a technology strategist. You're the guy that coined the digital divide, and we're going to talk about that. Yep. So I was struck by news reports that say when the refugees are moving into other countries, and of course they're being fed and clothed and housed and all of those things, but one of the first things that they're giving people when they get to safety is a SIM card. And that speaks to the power of technology and why it's so important for them to have that connectivity through their cell phones. So talk to me about that within the context of your role in bringing, I guess in bridging that digital divide, if you will, and you see where we are today in the world.
Well, one of the things we have to remember is for all the work that's been done on digital divide, there are still about 3 billion people out of the 7 billion who don't have access to the internet. But about 5 billion people do have access to some form of mobile device. Let's contrast that. I left the government in 1999. When I left the government, half the people on the planet
and tell people again what you were doing in the government in the Clinton administration, just so that they remember.
So in the Clinton administration, I was an assistant secretary of commerce. And I was a de facto internet policy advisor for Bill Clinton and Al Gore and 3 secretaries of commerce. So I really had, when there were 15 million people on the internet, my job was to help grow that and to help develop policies, paint the yellow lines that, we called it the information superhighway. I was the guy painting the yellow lines and the street signs for the information superhighway in the early 1990s. During my tenure in Commerce Department, we went from about 15 million people on the internet to pretty close to 1 billion people on the internet by the time I left. And now we're at about 4.5 billion people on the internet in the 20 years since. But half the world had never used a telephone in 1999. Half the world in 1999 lived 2 or more hours from the nearest telephone. It was a combination of the internet and the explosion in mobile technology that all of a sudden everyone on the planet now has access to information, to family, to government communications, to healthcare advice, to educational resources that they'd never had in the history of the world. And the thing about the internet/mobile revolution is that it happened pretty much around the world at the same time. The Industrial Revolution didn't happen that way. The Automobile Revolution didn't happen that way. The airplanes didn't happen around the world that way. But the wonderful thing about these telephones and the internet is almost all of us got introduced to those technologies between 1990 and 2020. Just has never happened before. Now, if you're a person from Ukraine, you can call for needed goods. You can get healthcare information. You can tell people who love you that you're there. You can figure out what you can use it to get access to government resources. It is maybe the critical tool, and to have been part of the revolution that helped people understand how important communications are, and to more importantly, to bring people who historically have been, on the other side of any new revolution to the revolution as it's happening. That's so powerful. But I know I was reading Twitter this morning, and I was talking to a friend who said, we were messaging back and forth, and she has a friend in Ukraine, and she said, I just because I needed to know, I texted my friend to see if she's all right, and she said, I'm eating a croissant. And, and he said, that gave her such joy that it's a little thing like that in the middle of a war where people are dying, to know that a friend had enough safety that she was somewhere eating a croissant. That's what these phones mean. If I have one like searing memory of this, it's a friend in America reaching out to a friend in Ukraine, her friend in Ukraine, and finding out that friend was eating a croissant this morning during this war. That's what these technologies allow us to know.
I was looking at a couple of the speeches that you've given through the years as I was preparing for this interview today. And in a couple of them, you talk about using mobile devices, sensors, and data analytics. All three of them together, you say that's when the magic happens. What do you mean by that?
I mean that when we talk about the measured life, that we now have the ability to know how we feel and let our doctors know. We have the ability to connect instantaneously. Give you an example. My stepdad, when he was alive, had diabetes, and it was fairly bad. Historically, we would not have known when he was having an episode because it was measured. Today, we can, on a daily basis, and in our community, Black communities, diabetes runs rampant. In Native American communities, diabetes runs rampant. We can use metrics, we can use mobile technologies so that a doctor on an almost daily basis can monitor what's happening to somebody who's a diabetic. We can do the same thing. We both had experience with folks who have dementia. On a daily basis, we can follow how they're doing and what they're doing. As I've gotten older, I have hypertension that's measured by, kept in check by medication. But my doctor historically could not have known on a daily basis. Today, on a daily basis, a healthcare provider can monitor. We can do so many things using these technologies, using analytics. You should be in 3 to 5 to 7 years be able to predict when somebody's going to have a diabetic problem, when somebody's going to have a hypertensive issue, when somebody needs to come in and see their doctor because of some other medical issue. Merlin couldn't have come up with that kind of alchemy back in medieval days. We can do things now to prolong life, to make life better, to make life more enjoyable by using these tools that we have. And that's always what I've always wanted to do. When I look at the community I come from, we disproportionately work longer for less pay, and as a result have worse health outcomes. And then the healthcare system doesn't work for us as well. And in addition to that, when you read about something like Serena Williams almost dying after having her child because the doctors didn't believe the amount of pain she was in, and when you read stories that we as Black people get different treatment, there's an assumption that our pain tolerances are higher. Measuring by using metrics, by using these types of technologies, we can make sure that the treatment that a poor Black woman gets when she has a child, notwithstanding a rich Black woman like Serena Williams, but a poor Black woman or a poor Native American or a poor Hispanic woman gets the same level of treatment and is monitored the same way as the richest woman living in River Oaks gets. Those are the kinds of tools and technologies. That's when I say the magic happens. We can make life so much better by using the tools we have, but we can also take some of the bias out if we have young, smart people who are looking for bias in these algorithms, because one of the things that we've noticed is, I remember one example, and I'll give an example. In hiring, one major tech company wanted to use algorithms to hire. And they saw at the end of the process that what they were getting, they wanted to say, how do we hire successfully? And at the end of their process, they found that all the candidates that they were approving to be interviewed were white males. And the reason, because the metrics for success historically in that company had always been white males. So they measured new folks coming in the same way they measured the old folks already had.
What's the answer to that? How do we fix that? How do we break that bias?
You have to have people of color. You have to have women. You have to have people of different socioeconomic and cultural origins involved in the process of creating the algorithms. And unfortunately, part of that starts with STEM. We don't, we're not graduating as many Black, Latino, women, STEM practitioners as we should and could, but we will be. Increasingly we're seeing that, and that's the magic, the key to that. That's not magic. That's just do the hard work, go out and find some folks. Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Northwestern, MIT, Caltech, Howard, Morehouse, Spelman, Tougaloo are all graduating smart young Black people. Hispanic serving institutions are, there are a lot of smart folks. You may have to train them a little bit more. They may not have had the the foundational studies in high schools because of the inequities in our high school system. But there are a lot of smart people of color. And one of the things that I keep reminding my friends in tech, because I still do a lot in tech, this year, you're going to have several million people turn 18. 52% of those people are Black, Brown, Asian, or Native American. 52 out of every 100.
I would say, and I'm not the only one who believes this, and I don't typically make, overt political statements on this show, but I do believe that that is one of the reasons why our state legislature has changed our voting laws. And I can tell you firsthand, it was a nightmare voting in the primary. I mean, for me, I have my own story. There are tons of stories out there. It's a mess.
Well, when you see them,
but it's a purposeful mess. It was purposely done this way.
They're trying to reduce the number of young people, Black people, Latinos, Native American, Asians, and women who vote because they disproportionately vote in a way that the existing power structure doesn't like. Yeah, we're going to have, I'm one of the, when I look at the Supreme Court Constitution, and I'm not going to be overtly pro, but I'm a lawyer. When I look at the Constitution of the Supreme Court, I do worry about what the next 4 to 5 to 10 to 20 years looks like, because it seems very much like 1876, the post-Reconstruction period. From 1865 to 1876, there was this huge increase in civil rights for Blacks and Browns. From 1876 to 1899, you saw a retrenchment that led to Jim Crow that lasted a century. So, or half of the last century. So we do have to be wary of that. And voting is a fundamental right. If you want a representational government, when you have people say we're trying to protect against fraud, and then you ask them, well, where is the fraud? And they can't show you any examples of fraud. Or the examples they're showing you are of the chief of staff of the president of the United States saying he lives in a trailer that he's never actually visited.
Forget what the courts have said, right? Forget what the courts have said, that there was no fraud. Right. And you obviously are well versed in this. Are you still on the board of the Texas Tribune?
I am still on the board of the Texas Tribune.
Okay.
That goes back to Mickey.
Well versed in what's going on here in Texas then.
I read the Texas Tribune, every day. I spend a significant amount of time on the Texas Tribune's website, and every day I watch PBS NewsHour and see what we're reporting on the PBS NewsHour. And one of the things that we talked earlier, the brief conversation we had earlier today, you're a storyteller, and I'm not a storyteller by nature, but I love supporting storytellers. I think we need platforms where great objective storytellers and non-objective storytellers, but with the Tribune and PBS in particular, there's a need for objectivity, news that's not slanted, that most of the people listening to this podcast, most people in this country can make up their own mind if you give them the straight skinny. So I want to support institutions like the Texas Tribune, like PBS, that provide the story unadulterated, without a whole bunch of editorializing around it. Here are the facts, ma'am, sir. You make up your mind as to what you want to think of that. No one does it better than Evan Smith in the Texas Tribune, except maybe public broadcasting and Judy.
So let's talk about that, because you're a fairly new chair of the board of PBS. So tell our audience, what's going on at PBS, what they can expect in the future, and how I'm curious about how you're using your technology background as you're moving forward in this role as the chairman of the board of PBS.
Well, I want to be careful because I don't want to get ahead of myself. I haven't had my first meeting yet as chair. I was elected in December, but I haven't actually sat down with the other 26 board members. I was on the board for 10 years before, and I stepped off for 2 years and I came back. PBS to me is a national treasure. It's a national treasure because it is the single most trusted public institution in a country in which most public institutions, from Congress to the courts to, the Forest Service, we've seen the numbers decline. We're still trusted. And to me, that's, when I talk to my wife, my wife and I have been together for 47 years, either as a couple or married. When I talk to my wife, she's always like, "Oh, so all you can do is screw this up, right?" So, what I can do is, nobody knows you as well as your spouse. What we hope to do is keep it as good as it is, as trusted as, and maybe make it a little bit better. And to your point with regard to digital technology, I have nieces and nephews who have never, the concept of coming home at 8 or 9 o'clock to watch Friends or to, or, Cheers, or, getting home at 7 o'clock on Sunday night to watch 60 Minutes. Like, why would you do that? You just watch it later, or you DVR or whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
so it's a whole new concept of, and how do we at PBS, using PBS Digital, how do we use technology to expand our audience to reach more people? I know that across the community of PBS, we believe that great storytellers need somewhere to tell those stories. And that there are a lot of untold American stories. Whether you're black, or you're brown, or you're aged, or you're Native American, or you're rural American. When I was on the board of Independent Television Service, ITVS, which they ran the thread of the Independent Lens series, which runs on most stations on Tuesday nights. But Independent Lens I was on their board. And when I first joined the board, I have a good friend. At the time, I had a good friend. He's still a congressman named Hal Rogers. Hal Rogers is the congressman from the poorest Republican district in the country. It's coal mining country that's basically been hollowed out. And he was on the Appropriations Committee in Congress. And I would go see him, a proudly member of Independent Lens. And I was talking to one of his staffers. And his staffer says, Larry, I love a lot of what I see on Independent Lens. But one of the things you got to remember, there are a lot of folks who don't live on the two coasts, who don't live around the Great Lakes, who also have stories to tell. How often do we see a story out of Temple, Texas? How often do we see a story out of Kansas? How often do we see a story out of Idaho? And so what I look at diversity in all of its forms, that every person in America is a taxpayer. They all care about this institution. All of those stories need to be told. We want more black stories. We want more stories by women. We want more stories by Latinos. But I also want more rural stories, because I've never believed that you can dislike and particularly can't hate a person if you know their stories. It's what you do so well with your podcast, that if I know your story, if I understand who you are as a human being, if I get what matters to you, if I know how you love your mom and how you think about your kids and what your grandma taught you, I can't hate you. I can't even dislike you. And so public broadcasting to me is a place where we can tell all of those stories. We have the time, we have the talent, we have the inclination to bring this nation together. And at a time when there's so many processes pulling us apart, my goal is to use technology, to use the incredible talent of the people at public broadcasting brings together. And there's one other thing. I'm just slightly older than the generation of children who grew up on public broadcasting, but I've watched several generations of children grow up on PBS Kids. And there really isn't a more wholesome, non-commercial place for your kid to learn some values, to learn about the world, learn about themselves, expand their minds, and not be, buffeted by somebody trying to sell them a toy, or unboxing commercials, or, program length commercials. Those things, it's important that we treat our children as children, our most precious resource, and give them the skill set. And I do know that you see better educational outcomes from kids who have been exposed to good quality educational programming at an early age. So between PBS trying to take care of our kids and giving them good life lessons and skilling them up, if that's the right term, and public broadcasting, where else do you get arts and nature and compelling stories and civil rights and, so many news, so many great things that all of us need and want. And there's something for every American on public broadcasting to just explore. And using technology, you don't have to, go on the nature night block or the cultural night block or whatever. You can do it every day. And that's something that matters to me. Making these great stories, making these great programs available to every person, not just during primetime hours, but whenever they want to reach them,
Whenever they want
their convenience, wherever and whenever.
Wherever and whenever. So when you talk about the power of storytelling and how it's really impossible to hate someone when you're up close and personal and you've actually had a chance to talk to them and to hear their story and to see kind of where they're coming from, what their perspective is, and where the connections might lie. This podcast is, as we've talked previously about, is just about making sure that we can see each other in someone else's story. And I always ask this question, which is, when have you felt like the other at some point in your life, either personally or professionally? And, what did that make you feel like? And how did you respond? And what did you learn from that? What can you share with us when you think back to something that might have been particularly painful or challenging, where you had to just get through it and then move forward?
So it'll take tie together a lot of the things we've already talked about. The hardest thing I've ever had to do professionally. Today, I'm I'm in the Internet Hall of Fame because of the digital divide. I'm often lauded for having been the guy who came with the digital divide, and yet professionally, that was probably the hardest thing I ever had to do. And let me give you a little backstory. So when I was working for our mutual friend, the great Mickey Leland, we discovered that in the 1980s, if you were black or brown, you were 20 to 30% less likely to have a telephone in your home than if you were white and affluent. So in my hometown of Brooklyn, literally 1 out of 5 households in where I grew up didn't have a telephone in the 1980s. In Houston, we saw that in some communities in Houston, black communities, 3rd Ward, 4th Ward, 5th Ward, as many as 1 in 4 households in those communities didn't have just a basic telephone. And so Mickey did some things, and I worked with him on some things to bring, there's a Lifeline telephone service that reduced prices for low-income people, and there's a link-up telephone service that it was a time when a lot of folks who are younger don't know this, but you had to give the telephone company $100 to get a phone. And for a lot of black folks in 1982 and 1983, $100 that's a big step. You'd have that $100 and you had a past due bill, you couldn't get a telephone. So we did some things to create more opportunity for people to get telephones and in their homes. So fast forward to the internet. And I'm looking at this internet thing created, and you can tell it's going to take off like a rocket ship if you're paying attention. And I realized then that some of us can be left behind. That if a household didn't have a telephone in the 1980s, the likelihood they're going to have a computer and an internet line in the 1990s was really slim. So early on in the process, we started in 1994-95, I commissioned a study by the Census Bureau. So we started looking at the term, at who's connected to the internet, who had a computer in the home, who didn't. And then we did it again in 1996, and we did it in 1999. And by 1999, we saw that the gap was widening, that affluent suburban white households and some affluent black households had telephones. But if you were black, if you were brown, if you were English was a second language, if you were a single mom, if you were below a certain income level, if you were below a certain educational level, you were less likely to have the internet. And that's where the term digital divide came up. But there were so many people, progressive Democrats, who weren't from my neighborhood, didn't have my background, who thought that, this internet thing will take care of itself and the market will adjust it. And I really had to fight. And the tech industry really hated the term digital divide because they, remember when Cisco and, sock puppets on TV and everything about the internet was bright and shiny and new. And as a friend of mine, like I say, everybody wants to chase the shiny, and they want to keep it shiny. And folks in Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley in New York kind of thought my digital divide stuff was taking some of the shine off the shiny. And so keep that quiet. Don't really talk about this. We only want to talk about the good stuff. And I'm like, no, because if we don't talk about the good stuff, we're going to be even later taking care of the folks that I also care about. I had a lot of political struggles within the Commerce Department, with some in the White House about using the term digital divide. But here's the good news. The good news was at the time Bill Clinton was from the same, side of the tracks in Arkansas that I was from the side of the tracks in Brooklyn. Both of us were on the other side of the tracks. So through some friends who worked directly for the president, when I was getting some pressure from people who above me but below him, I basically said, what's the president think about the term digital divide and maybe getting rid of the term? And, in Bill Clinton's inimitable way, according to my friend, he said, why would we ever do that? That digital divide, people love that digital divide. And, and Clinton gets it immediately because viscerally, he's still that boy from Hope. He's still that poor boy from Hope. And that's why in government it is so important to have people who come from these communities, who understand what it's like to be poor, who've actually had a welfare cheese, a welfare peanut butter sandwich back in the 1960s, or going with their mom with a card, but you get looked at that funny in the supermarket in the 2000s and 2020s. We need folks from all walks of life so we understand it. Because I will assure you that had I not been the Assistant Secretary of Commerce and had I not been, empowered by men like Mickey Leland and Ron Brown and others who said, stand up for what's right no matter what the cost. If I hadn't had that kind of training and I hadn't had my background, the digital divide would have been an afterthought. It's not that people wouldn't have gotten around to it, but it wouldn't have been a priority. And what I wanted to do is take it off the back shelf and put it on the front shelf. This is something we have to focus on. And, if I had a dime for every time the term digital divide has been used since we first popularized it, I would never have to work again a second in my life. But more importantly, because of the number of times it's been raised, that number of 5 to 5 billion people being on the internet today, that family in the Ukraine that had that SIM card That happened because of those conversations back in the 1990s. And that happened because of conversations with Mickey Leland back in the 1980s. And that happened because of what Mickey Leland saw growing up in the Third Ward in the 1970s and 60s. And, I'm part of a spectrum of things that had to have happened. I'm proud of what I did, but I'm more proud to be part of that spectrum.
Wow, you just brought it all full circle. You tied together all of those threads so beautifully. So, as we start to wrap up, what's the next big challenge, do you think, in the technology sphere? Is it regulation? Is it expansion? I mean, what's the next big thing?
We, every technology, whenever we create it, has all these, people always talk about all the positive uses to which the technology can be put. And every technology revolution somehow winds up with things that we don't want. It kind of goes to its crassest, most commercial form. But then there are always these oases of, if you look at film, blaxploitation film or violent film, whatever. If you look at television, the crass commercialization of children's television, so much garbage that, parents don't want, one of my other mentors and idols is Newt Minow, who called it a vast wasteland in the 1960s. I think we're going through the same thing with the internet. And I think particularly with regard to social media, there are times when I see the bullying of particularly young girls in their bodies and how they look at themselves. When I look at the hate speech, when I look at Klansmen and neo-Nazis and QAnon forming themselves around social media using these technology and tools, that frightens me. But I don't believe that the way that only regulation is the solution. I think we need positive places. As journalism kind of took a dive and we started seeing the Irving Groups and others taking out people, we started seeing these huge conglomerates buying up and getting rid of local news and reducing what we saw. You saw things like Texas Tribune pop up. We saw that up in Boston, in Chicago, the Sun-Times was bought by a public radio station. We started seeing alternative ways of getting information to people. I think we're going to see something like that in social media. I don't know, a person, or particularly not a parent or a grandparent, who doesn't hate what their children see on Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and so many of the other outlets. I think there's going to be a rationalization where there'll be a nonprofit model where it's something better than what we see now, that public media will spin out. It won't be PBS, I don't believe, but I do believe that the public will coalesce and find some positive places and spaces online. If I had a child, my wife and I are childless, but I do have nieces and nephews, I wouldn't want them spending any amount of time on social media today. And there are actually times like during the election of last year, and I'm like, I've always been so proud of getting the internet into more people's hands, and I've never been so disgusted as looking at what getting that internet has meant. So I think the next big challenge is how do we find places? I hate the term safe spaces, but how do we find public-oriented spaces? How do we find positive spaces? How do we find spaces on the web that make you feel better, that where all of us can come with this kind of a commons that is a uplifting commons? That I think is one of the challenges that I'm looking at. I don't know. I found a friend from 50 years ago. I went to a junior high school in Queens. I was bused to a junior high school in Queens. And there was this young woman, Gwen Schneidkraut, then now Oliker, who was a very, very close friend of mine when I was in junior high school. I had not talked to her in 50 years. And through Facebook, we refound each other and have reconnected. And we'll see each other at some point when I'm in LA or she's here. That's the magic of Facebook. But then I see when the Comet ping pong, when you had a QAnon guy going up there wanting to kill people because of a rumor he saw on Facebook that they were pedophiles and killing children in the basement, raping children in the basement. That's the downside. And sorry, Gwen, I didn't mean to connect you with this crazy guy, but I see the ups and the downs. We've got to find a way that we can clarify the positive, keep telling to the uplifting stories, and get rid of some of the noise and the hatred and violence. And here's the thing. It was a business decision that drives people to QAnon. There are business decisions that drive people to hate groups. There are business decisions driving people to mythologies about COVID. There are business decisions driving people toward these improper body views. Folks are making money by appealing to our basest side. There's got to be a non-commercial way that we can use these technologies to uplift.
And so I hear you about trying to find the more positive content and finding ways to move people in that direction. You mentioned that regulation might be a part of it, but it's certainly not the only answer. But where are you on regulation? Do you think that there should be some regulation of what these companies are allowed to do, and how far can we go?
So I would start with antitrust because I do think that the size of some of these companies and the power they have to affect the marketplace is somewhat troubling. But I also I am not a reflexive regulator, and the reason is the folks who build these companies and who run these companies know a lot more about the companies than the folks who regulate these companies, and I think that's particularly true right now with the internet. I don't know that we have the. I think you need you need some fine tuning, and legislation is more of an axe than it is a scissors, if that's the right term. Okay. I don't know that we have the skill set right now to know exactly what are the right solution set. And that's the thing that troubles me. Mm. I do know that we need continued oversight. I do believe that the government allowed some mergers that I would not have allowed if I'd been the antitrust czar. I've been a long time as an antitrust lawyer, but I do think that big is not always the best. But I am very leery of saying that I don't believe anybody has the regulatory or legislative answers right now. And that's the thing that troubles me. Yeah. But I also think that there is an opportunity for other bodies to create, in the same way the Texas Tribune, created, same way that public broadcasting has become more popular. There is a starvation out there. There is a hunger, is a better word. People are thirsty for things that are not base and crass and totally commercially driven. And so we need to find more ways to create more of those kinds of opportunities while we're trying to figure out what the right set of legislative and regulatory tools are. I do think that, there is something, when you see the success of Twitter and Facebook and TikTok, there is something about us as human beings that makes us want to commune. That doesn't mean that the people who run those companies necessarily have our best interests at heart. And we've got to figure out how to balance having people commune, allowing the size, the scope and scale that allows these things to be ubiquitous global companies without having one or two czars of what we're going to see manipulate us into being our worst selves rather than our best selves.
And as individuals, while all of that is going on and all of those challenges are being worked out by the folks who have the opportunity to actually make decisions in that regard, we can start to do a better job of communicating with each other on a one-to-one human level. And that's the space that I'm living in terms of what I'm trying to do with the kind of conversations that we're having on the podcast and the conversation that we had just now.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think we all need hugs after 2 years of not touching other human beings except the people who live in our house. And whether it's a virtual hug online or a actual hug, I went to a couple of board meetings this weekend, and it was great to see people that I've talked to maybe every day or several times a week on the telephone to actually be able to give them I'm still masked up. As well, people in my family who have, health frailty, but, we, to your point, we need that human connection. We thrive on that human connection. Yeah. There's nothing more important to us than being important to somebody else. And technology can give us part of that. It can't give us all of that. But the kind of conversation we're having today, if I hope there's some young boy or girl who wants to be part of the spectrum of, Ron Brown, Larry Irving, Mickey Leland, and whoever influenced Mickey, because, take this forward. I don't know what the next technology is going to be, but I'm hoping there's some man or woman of color who's in another presidential administration saying, you know what, this is going to affect my community adversely if I don't fight for it. And it's worth giving up my job if I have to fight for it. It's worth going around my boss to the president or the secretary or whoever to get this done. Those are the things that I was taught and the things that I'm trying to teach young people. It's not about you. It's about all of us. And if you work hard and you're true to your point of reference, things will work out pretty well for you. I know they have for me.
You're remarkable, and I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to share your story and your perspective with our audience today. And I look forward to continuing the conversation and supporting all that you do. Thank you so much, Larry.
Thank you so much for the time. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks again to Larry for sharing his thoughts and perspectives with us today. And thank you for giving him permission to speak and having the courage to listen with an open mind. As always, we will link to everything that Larry is doing on our show notes at ourvoicesmatterpodcast.com. Thanks again for joining us, everybody. We'll see you next time. Thanks again to our sponsor, BMW of West Houston. There's a special offer for members of the Our Voices Matter podcast community. Just click the link in the show notes, bmwwest.com.